I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled New Year Starts, Same Old U.S. Proxy War Continues. And then, of course, after I wrote this, the U.S. launched a war of aggression against Venezuela. So, I mean, everything that I predicted about the Trump administration continuing on with all the neoconservative wars that President Bush, Obama, and Biden were picking up and carrying on with as each took their turn in office, everything that I warned about has now unfortunately come to pass. And I'm going to read this article, which is about the U.S. dirty war against Russia and revelations from the Western media itself, U.S.-based media itself, that the U.S. is essentially attacking Russia itself, and it's simply doing it under the cover of assisting Ukraine. They're attacking Russia, and they're specifically attacking Russian energy production, oil, essentially. And the U.S. last year attacked Iran, another major oil producer, and now they have just attacked Venezuela, another energy producer. And what do they all have in common? They're exporting primarily to China. And that's what this is all about. And I'm going to get to all of that in this article. Now that we know that the U.S. is pursuing regime change in Venezuela, has launched a war for regime change in Venezuela, just add that to everything that is in this article, and you will see how it's probably much worse than I'm even depicting. So while the United States government poses as pursuing peace with Russia regarding the ongoing war in Ukraine, it is now admitted that the U.S. is overseeing a supercharged campaign targeting Russian oil facilities and tankers aimed at crippling Russia's economy and its fighting capacity. It goes far beyond just targeting Russia and trying to somehow win the war in Ukraine. It goes far beyond that, because in reality, they know they're not going to win the war in Ukraine. As I pointed out many times in the past, the Rand Corporation's paper extending Russia admits that any war the U.S. is able to provoke inside of Ukraine with Russia is almost certainly going to end in Ukraine collapsing and losing. They knew that. They know that's what's going to happen. So they're not trying to win the war in Ukraine. They're trying to use Ukraine to cripple and degrade Russian energy production as much as possible ahead of a much larger, more dangerous, equally unnecessary war with China in the near future. The revelation should come as no surprise. The campaign of long-range aerial drone strikes conducted deep inside Russian territory, as well as maritime drone strikes taking place both within the Black Sea and far beyond it, including in the Mediterranean Sea and off the coast of West Africa, requires intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, ISR for short. Only the U.S. possesses. Only the U.S. has the capability to carry out these strikes. When they were taking place, I told people, only the U.S. can do this. It is the U.S. doing this. And they're simply laundering it politically through their Ukrainian proxies. It was obvious, and now the New York Times admits it. Not only has the U.S. made essential ISR available for these attacks, but both the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and at least the U.S. Navy have been implicated in assisting directly in these attacks. Of course they have. A New York Times article from early 2025, so this is an earlier article that I've referenced many times, The Partnership, this article here. This article right here, The Partnership, The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. This is the untold story of America's hidden role in Ukrainian military operations against Russia's invading armies. But of course, again, as I pointed out many times in the past, and again, as the Rand Corporation itself admits in the 2019 Extending Russia Competing from Advantageous Ground paper, they knew their options here, especially this one, provide lethal aid to Ukraine, would provoke a war with Russia. They knew it, and they did it anyway. And by the way, they did that under the first Trump administration. So while President Trump often refers to the war in Ukraine as Biden's war, I mean, he is equally responsible for precipitating it and now escalating it. He shares equal ownership with the Bush, Obama, and Biden administrations. If you really look at it over this whole course of the 21st century, has been working its way up towards that. So this article, The Partnership, The Secret History of the War in Ukraine, would admit in regards to repeated maritime drone strikes carried out across the Black Sea. So the New York Times is talking about maritime drone strikes across the Black Sea. This is what it said. The Biden administration had authorized helping the Ukrainians develop, manufacture, and deploy a nascent fleet of maritime drones to attack Russia's Black Sea fleet. So the Ukrainians didn't come up with any of this. The Americans created it and gave it to them, and then helped them use them to carry out these strikes if they weren't overseeing the whole operation themselves to begin with. And then it says in parentheses, the Americans gave the Ukrainians an early prototype meant to counter a Chinese naval assault on Taiwan, and also to strike at Chinese maritime shipping, which is something they are still preparing to do. And I will talk about that later in this article. First, the Navy was allowed to share points of interest for Russian warships just beyond Crimea's territorial waters, talking about the US Navy doing that. In October, with leeway to act within Crimea itself, the CIA covertly started supporting drone strikes on the port of Sevastopol. If Ukraine was incapable of conducting their own maritime drone strikes along the coast of Crimea, it most certainly would not have been able to conduct strikes much further abroad, meaning that the more recent strikes carried out far beyond the Black Sea almost certainly required as much or more direct U.S. involvement. And again, this all happened under the Trump administration. And another more recent New York Times article admits that President Trump approved of all of this. He was aware of it and he approved of all of it. So he picked up right where Biden left off, and he continued, just like I said he would. This has now been confirmed by a more recent New York Times article. This article, the separation inside the unraveling US-Ukraine partnership. Despite the title, there is no unraveling of the US-Ukraine partnership. Okay, there is none. They admit that the US is just running the entire war through Ukraine. So what partnership? Titled The Separation Inside the Unraveling U.S.-Ukraine Partnership, the article at first attempts to portray the administration of current U.S. President Donald Trump as undermining Ukraine amid continued conflict with Russia. But the article then admits that just beneath the facade of peace negotiations, the U.S. has actually escalated what has always been a U.S.-instigated and U.S.-led proxy war against Russia fought merely through Ukraine. The article admits, and this is a direct quote, even as Mr. Trump bullied Mr. Zelensky, he seemed to coddle Mr. Putin. When the Russian stiff-armed peace proposals and accelerated bombing campaigns on Ukrainian cities, Mr. Trump would lash out on Truth Social and ask his aides, do we sanction their banks or do we sanction their energy infrastructure? For months, he did neither. But in secret, the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. military, with his blessing, supercharged a Ukrainian campaign of drone strikes on Russian oil facilities and tankers to hobble Mr. Putin's war machine. So the U.S. is striking Russia secretly. The CIA is doing this under the guise of Ukraine doing this. And this is what the Trump administration was actually doing while it was lying about wanting peace with Russia. And again, I warned people that that's what was always going to happen. People have to understand that. And they will say, well, what about Vice President J.D. Vance? He wants the war in Ukraine to end because he wants to go confront China, which is actually an even more neoconservative thing to want to do. But you have to understand, you have to hobble Russian energy production if you want to isolate, cripple, and strangle China's economy. They share a long land border, and if Russia is able to send energy into China, no matter what else you do anywhere else, if you bomb the Belt and Road Initiative and you cut off all the maritime routes, and there's no energy coming into Chinese ports, but they're still getting energy over these over the land border with Russia, then they can weather a U.S. imposed blockade, a blockade to strangle China economically, which is why they will continue putting pressure on Russia. They will never stop putting pressure on Russia. They don't want peace. They're using Ukraine and the EU as an excuse not to agree on any sort of deal with Russia. They want to continue the war. They want to excuse themselves and have the Europeans go in it deeper. This is what they have said openly, and I will get into that as well. This dovetails with reports from October 2025 that U.S. intelligence agencies were assisting Ukraine in aerial drone strikes on Russian energy production facilities deep inside Russia. So this recent New York Times article admits the CIA is behind drone strikes inside Russia on energy production facilities. They're also behind the strikes on the tankers in the Black Sea, in the Mediterranean, off the coast of Africa. And we remember this older article. Remember this one? U.S. intelligence helps Ukraine target Russian energy infrastructure. That was the CIA doing that. That wasn't Ukraine doing that. It's the CIA doing it through Ukraine. So the more recent New York Times article also mentions tankers, implicating the U.S. in a series of recent maritime drone strikes carried out on Russian-linked tankers worldwide. The New York Times article explains further. This is, again, this is a quote from the more recent New York Times article, the separation inside the Unraveling U.S.-Ukraine partnership. And by the way, Alexander Maciorus was the first person who brought this to my attention. I heard him cover it on his channel, and I went in and read this article. In June, so this is from the New York Times, in June, beleaguered U.S. military officers met with their CIA counterparts to help craft a more concerted Ukrainian campaign. It would focus exclusively on oil refineries, and instead of supply tanks would target the refinery's Achilles heel. A CIA expert had identified a type of coupler that was so hard to replace or repair that a refinery would remain offline for weeks. To avoid backlash, they would not supply weapons and other equipment that Mr. Vance's allies wanted for other priorities. So they always have a way of working around any sort of limit on their actions, and those limits are placed there for political purposes and for public relations. And it's not because the US doesn't want to do it and the CIA has to do it secretly on their own. No, they have to do it in a way that upholds the illusion the US wants peace with Russia, even when the US itself is waging a dirty war against Russia. The article also says the energy strikes would come to cost the Russian economy as much as $75 million a day, according to one U.S. intelligence estimate. You know, we could debate about that and the effect this campaign has had on Russian energy production and exports. We could debate that, but the fact is they are carrying out these strikes. We see these strikes take place. We see Russia acknowledge that these strikes are taking place. And if you do them often enough, long enough, if you begin expanding these campaigns wide enough, it will eventually make an impact, whether you want to admit it or not. The New York Times also says the CIA would also be authorized to assist with Ukrainian drone strikes on shadow fleet vessels in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Gas lines would start forming around Russia. That's what they claim in the New York Times article. So the CIA assisting Ukraine in maritime drone strikes means the CIA conducting maritime drone strikes. Ukraine doesn't have a military base anywhere in Africa that it could use to stage and launch these maritime drones. They don't have the capability to find these vessels, to ID them, to target them and track them. They don't have the network that will allow them to lead the drone to the ship and actually strike it. Only the US has these capabilities. So at best, they have a Ukrainian in the room watching the CIA carry out this strike on Russian energy exports. That is what's going on here. This is what the New York Times is admitting. If you think about it carefully, that is what they are admitting in this article. In other words, the US launched attacks on Russian energy production inside Russia, as well as conducted maritime drone strikes on tankers moving Russian hydrocarbons wherever the US could find them. All of this politically laundered through Washington's Ukrainian proxies, attacks Ukraine itself would be incapable of conducting on its own. I just explained that to you. Let's talk about President Trump, how he helped start the war with Russia and is helping escalate it. I'm not picking on President Trump. President Biden and President Obama all played a role in this, and even as far back as President George Bush Jr. Just looking across the entire 21st century of US war abroad, its meddling abroad, this is all the US has been leading up to. They have been working on this throughout the entire 21st century. So it's not Trump's idea, it's not Biden's war, wasn't Obama's plan to overthrow Ukraine. These were things that were going to happen no matter who was in the White House and no matter who controlled Congress, because neither actually drive US foreign policy. Corporate financier interests, the think tanks that they fund and direct, determine US foreign and domestic policy. It's simply laundered politically through Washington. While US President Donald Trump has repeatedly depicted the ongoing conflict in Ukraine as Biden's war, and he has done this, he blames Biden for everything, and that's what Obama did. He blamed Bush for everything, and Biden blamed Trump for everything. And in here, It was Joe Biden's war, not my war, Trump told 60 Minutes, talking about Ukraine, okay? So this is what President Trump always tells his supporters, and his supporters, for some reason, believe it. It was actually precipitated and prosecuted by a combined effort spanning the Obama, first Trump, Biden, and now second Trump administrations. It was under the Biden administration that the US violently overthrew the Ukrainian government after years of attempted color revolution stretching all the way back to 2004. Remember I said President George Bush Jr., he was president in 2004, US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. They talk about how the US was overthrowing governments in Eastern Europe to encircle and contain Russia, and how they were trying to overthrow the government in Ukraine at the time, and how it was entirely an American creation. US government deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, and the two big American parties, and US non-government organizations. They talk about how they overthrew the government in Serbia, Georgia. They attempted to overthrow the government of Belarus. And in 2004, they were trying to overthrow the government in Ukraine. And then in 2014, they tried again and they succeeded. It was under the first Trump administration that lethal military aid began flowing publicly from the US to Ukraine. Maybe there were weapons going to Ukraine under the Obama administration, probably, but it was under the Trump administration that it was just openly being done. This is ABC News. 2019, Trump administration approves new sale of anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. This was October. That is the same year that the RAND Corporation published their Extending Russia paper, and they even suggested, right here, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. So President Trump provided lethal aid to Ukraine. And I mentioned that. This was a policy option. The RAND Corporation, its 2019 paper, Extending Russia, admitted would likely lead to, and this is a quote, more Russian aid to the separatists, they're talking about in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine, and an additional Russian troop presence. Policymakers hoped, in turn, would overextend Russia in the same way America's proxy war with the Soviet Union had in Afghanistan. The paper also inferred that providing lethal aid to Ukraine could ultimately lead to a large-scale conflict ending in, and again, a direct quote from the RAND Corporation paper, disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows, and that it might even lead to a disadvantageous peace for Ukraine in the end, all of which has now begun taking shape. All of this has now happened, and it looks almost certain that Ukraine will either collapse or in some way suffer from a disadvantageous peace when all of this is said and done. That was what the RAND Corporation said would happen, and then the Trump administration sent lethal aid to Ukraine, knowing that this would happen. Considering the role each US administration played since 2014 in provoking and expanding this conflict, it should come as no surprise that President Trump simply picked up right where both his predecessors and he himself had left off last. So this should surprise nobody. He was part of the process of starting this war in the first place. Why are people surprised that he's escalating it and that his interest in pursuing peace is entirely disingenuous, deliberately disingenuous, and that while he's talking peace, pretending to talk peace, I should say, he's authorizing the CIA to carry out what are essentially US strikes on Russia directly? Let's talk about US peace negotiations and division of labor, because that's what the peace negotiations really are meant to do. It's meant to excuse the US from this conflict and force Europe to spend more on what would be the continuation of this US proxy war. The US would still be making all of the decisions but Europe would be taking up all the risk and costs of. The very idea that the US now suddenly seeks to end a proxy war of its own design is itself a key function of perpetuating it even further. Okay, and I will explain how. In February 2025, US Secretary of Defense, now US Secretary of War, again, they were openly telling you where this was all headed, and people chose to ignore it. So Secretary Hegseth would deliver a directive to European nations in Brussels. And again, I've referenced this many times, and you need to read this if you have not read it already. This is the whole plan. The whole plan is to either freeze the conflict or force Europe into the conflict next. That's what Secretary Hegseth told Europe they would do. And then Europe from that point onward, did literally every single thing they were told to by Secretary Hegseth. So there is no US-European split. They're doing exactly what they were told, all under the cover of a US-European split. They have to pose as being split and Europe isolated and abandoned so that they can sell the idea to the European public that they need to make greater, unprecedented sacrifices to continue this proxy war without the US. So Secretary Hegseth demanded that they increase their spending to 5% of their respective GDPs, double down on arming and backing Ukraine, expand their defense industrial bases, prepare the European public for spending more on defense, as well as preparing European and non-European troops for deployment inside Ukraine. All of these demands were made under the framework of what Secretary Hegseth himself called a division of labor, within which Europe would take up a greater role in Washington's proxy war with Russia, while the US committed greater resources for an equally unnecessary confrontation with China in the Asia-Pacific region. And again, these two conflicts are directly connected. You cannot do one without the other, which is why the US is never actually going to make peace or accommodate Russia in any shape, form, or way. Not as long as the current interests driving US foreign policy persist. No part of this directive suggested a genuine desire to end the conflict in Ukraine, but rather an attempt to either freeze it under a Minsk 3.0 style ceasefire or otherwise pass the majority of the cost and risk of continuing the conflict onto Washington's European proxies. Since then, the US and Europe have posed as splitting, enabling European politicians to depict themselves before the European public as abandoned by the United States and thus left with no other alternative but spending more on defense, just as Secretary Hegseth told them to do. In fact, in a New Year's Eve address, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz would literally say, and that is from this New York Times article here. Again, all of these will be in the video description below. Relationship between US and Germany is changing, German leader says, but actually it's not. Actually, it isn't. This is what Chancellor Merz would say. For us Europeans, this means that we must defend and assert our interests much more strongly by ourselves, which is exactly what Secretary Hegseth ordered European leaders to do in early 2025 under his division of labor framework. Under any division of labor, the overall project is not being abandoned by any participant. Rather, various aspects of the project are assigned to different participants. The project at hand for the US is its continued decade-spanning pursuit of global domination. The US is merely feeding Europe into its proxy war with Russia to a greater extent and at greater risk to Europe than ever before. The US has and will continue to oversee the entire conflict, making all major decisions, as it has done from its military command center in Wiesbaden, Germany, and making available unique ISR capabilities only the US possesses to continue its proxy war with Russia, simply swapping out its exhausted Ukrainian proxies with fresher European proxies. And again, it's not that the US expects Europe to fight and defeat Russia, it's to continue degrading and overextending Russia to the fullest extent possible. It does not matter whether Europe wins or loses, just continues exhausting Russia. That's all that counts. The US doesn't care what happens to Europe. Look what the US has already done to Europe in the process of waging this proxy war. The fact that the United States has escalated its proxy war with Russia through attacks it itself is planning and carrying out merely under the guise of a Ukrainian campaign proves America's actual intentions regardless of its empty rhetoric regarding peace. So again, people are saying the US is abandoning Europe, there's a split, they disagree, Europe wants to keep fighting the war, the US wants to end the war, but it's the US that's actually escalating by carrying out attacks itself on Russia covertly through the CIA. That's what the US is actually doing, versus President Trump just saying, oh, we want peace. The Europeans are keeping us from getting peace. The Ukrainians are keeping us from getting peace. We don't know what to say or do to make the Europeans and the Ukrainians, who depend completely on us for everything, we have no idea what leverage we could possibly find to make them do what we want. So it's just lies. It's just more lies, just like with Venezuela. All absolute lies, transparent lies that anyone that is actually interested in the truth can spend 5 minutes to pick apart conclusively. Let's talk about the US proxy war with Russia and how it is key to containing China, which is why they will never give up a proxy war with Russia as long as their ultimate goal is openly to contain China. In the background of Washington's ongoing war on Russia is a much larger and more urgent policy of confronting and containing China, an imperative that necessitates continued pressure on China's allies in Moscow. Much of Washington's strategy in confronting and containing China is based on a combination of maritime distant blockades imposed by a now completely reconfigured anti-shipping centric U.S. Marine Corps, attacks and disruptions along China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, land routes, as well as the degradation of Russian energy production that could sustain China's economy and warfighting capacity, even if the former two options are successfully implemented. Laid out in detail in a 2018 U.S. Naval War College Review paper titled A Maritime Oil Blockade Against China. I've gone over this many times, and more often, very recently, as this all obviously takes shape. This was written all the way back in 2018, a maritime oil blockade against China, tactically tempting but strategically flawed. It's not strategically flawed in the sense that it's impossible to do. It was strategically flawed in 2018 for a list of reasons they have since addressed. So laid out in this paper, the US would impose a maritime blockade against Chinese shipping lanes across the Asia-Pacific region, including in the Malacca Strait, the South China Sea, and in and around the waters of the island province of Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea. And if you go to the paper, it has a map. It has a map of the places the US will use to interdict Chinese maritime shipping in all of these areas. And we see China reacting by militarizing some of these areas, especially the South China Sea, but it's specifically in reaction to the US. The US has tens of thousands of troops closer to China than they are to the actual United States they're supposedly defending. If it was the other way around, the US would never accept it. And we know that because the most recent National Security Strategy paper published by the Trump administration said they will not have any non-hemispheric power operate in Latin America. They're excluded. They can't put forces there. They can't even do business there. And yet the US is entitled to do whatever it wants right off of China's shores, and China's not allowed to do anything about it. So you can see the problem that the rest of the world is merely reacting to. This isn't about Chinese aggression. This is about US aggression, encroachment, encirclement, and the threat they pose to China, and China reacting in the way any sovereign nation would. The paper also discusses the necessity to disrupt China's Belt and Road Initiative, which serves as alternative routes circumventing possible U.S. maritime blockades. At one point in the paper, it suggests that the U.S. could demand BRI partner nations to shut down pipelines for the duration of any U.S.-imposed action, and any failure to comply would result in U.S., and this is a direct quote, airstrikes, aerial mining, or other kinetic action. It should be noted that since the paper was published in 2018, the U.S. has already begun carrying out strikes by proxy against BRI infrastructure, including on a Myanmar-China pipeline the paper used specifically as an example. And again, right here, they talk about the Myanmar-China pipeline. And since then, this was 2018. Since then, this is 2025, Myanmar junta, which is what the US and Europe calls the government in Myanmar, abandons Chinese pipeline amid resistance attacks. The resistance, the quote-unquote resistance, are armed terrorists and drug gangs. Very ironically, drug gangs. The US is arming and backing to overthrow the central government in Myanmar, but also attack Chinese investments and specifically cut this pipeline. And if you go to the 2018 paper, you see these choke points that the US seeks to close. The pipeline goes from here on the coast of Myanmar to China. This is the border between Myanmar and China. So if you cut that, now that was a way that you could circumvent this blockade. Now they can't, because the US-backed terrorists have taken over a section of the pipeline. You take over a section of the pipeline, the whole pipeline's useless. The 2018 paper then mentions Russia, noting that existing and expanding pipelines in 2018 could allow China to adapt to any attempt by the US to impose a maritime oil blockade on it. While no measures are proposed on how to mitigate Russian oil exports to China in the 2018 paper. Since then, the US has successfully provoked a large-scale protracted proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. As the New York Times has recently reported, the US has begun conducting large-scale strikes against Russian energy production inside Russia, as well as targeting Russian maritime energy exports, part of a US blockading policy that is also targeting Russian Chinese ally Venezuela in Latin America and Iran in the Middle East, a policy that has already seized ships bound for China itself. And now we see the US carrying out a direct military strike on Venezuela, kidnapping the Venezuelan president and threatening to seize, actually demanding that it gets to seize all Venezuelan oil production, or more strikes will be carried out as of the recording of this video. Because the US seeks to continue encircling and containing China and degrading Russian energy production, and Russia's utility as a Chinese ally in general is a key prerequisite in doing so, the US is almost certainly not going to end its proxy war against Russia. The only thing that they're going to try to do is drag it out for as long as possible. They want a ceasefire. They can still carry out terrorist attacks on Russia that they could blame on Ukraine. And if they can get European troops in on the ground on Ukraine after a ceasefire, they essentially freeze it in the same way they froze the conflict in Syria. And we all saw how that ended for Syria and also for Syria's Russian and Iranian allies. Instead, it will continue, possibly even escalate its campaign striking Russian energy production inside Russia, Russian pipelines, and maritime oil shipping, and gradually expanding operations to set the stage for similar operations aimed at China directly. Of course, that's where all of this is headed. Thus, Washington's peace negotiations amount to empty rhetoric drowned out by America's own actions through its Ukrainian and European proxies in a war that seeks to set the stage for an even larger, more dangerous confrontation with China. Russia, and ultimately China's ability to counter not only US proxy warfare, but also the tools it uses to set the stage for it, including America's so far completely uncontested global information dominance and the ability of potential US proxies to defend themselves, defend their information space against US political capture. In other words, Venezuela, for example. What did Russia and China do to help Venezuela protect its political and information space to prevent the US from creating the conditions on the ground that cause all the political instability and chaos that has rotted Venezuela from inside out? The same thing happened to Syria. The same thing is actually happening in Iran. They do not protect their information space as rigorously as you would think that they should. Only, I would say, Russia and China really do. And there seems to be either no interest in these partner or potential partner nations to secure their information space, or Russia and China have not sufficiently explained why it's so important or given them viable options to do so. But this is imperative. And if they cannot do this, it's very unlikely they will be able to do anything else. No matter how powerful Russia and China are on their own, if the US is able to surround them with proxies, dysfunctional nations, destroyed nations, they themselves can only hold out on their own for so long. Whether people want to admit that or not, that is a reality. So Russia and ultimately China's ability to counter not only US proxy warfare, but also the tools it uses to set the stage for it, will determine whether or not US policy is blunted and stopped, or allowed to draw the rest of the world into the destructive conflict currently consuming both Russia and Europe. It'll just get worse. It will only get worse. And as the US war of aggression on Venezuela proves, and as they're setting the stage for another round of hostilities against Iran proves, President Trump was never going to stop any of this. He never intended to. If you listen to what he actually said objectively, if you filter out your own bias and listen to what he actually said and what, the voice of reason, J.D. Vance, was actually saying, even before they took office, they were talking about ceasefire, a freeze in Ukraine, so they could do China and then get back to Russia. They were never going to reconcile with Russia. They had no intention of ever doing that. They are all proponents of American primacy over the globe. They are all proponents of this long-standing, enduring US strategy that calls for ensuring no rivals develop, no peer or near peer adversaries allowed. That was the policy at the end of the Cold War. That is the policy today. No matter who is in the White House, no matter who controls Congress, the only thing that's going to change are the faces you look at and the lies you have to listen to as they continue all of this uninterrupted into the future. It will only stop when people make it stop. These people are not going to stop on their own. They have no reverse gear, and they're willing to do absolutely anything to advance their agenda. And you have to understand that they will never, ever let anyone that is a danger to that agenda get anywhere near any kind of election, let alone the presidency. President Trump is backed by all of these special interests that are writing these policy papers. So they knew he was going to do what they told him. And they depended on his ability to dupe the American people into believing otherwise. And that's what he has done. I hope more people are waking up to it now. Our future depends on it. Not just the future of the rest of the world, but the future of America and the American people themselves. They're not benefiting from this either. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been supporting my work, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just helping out by liking, sharing, posting a kind comment, sending a news tip, all of this is greatly appreciated. All of this helps to make this work possible. I sincerely appreciate all of this support, no matter what form it takes. And as always, thank you for watching.